Hello and welcome to Food Tank's webinar series. My name is Sarah Small and I'm Food Tank's Chief of Staff. I'm really excited about today's webinar with Anuradha Mittal. Anuradha is the founder and executive director of the Oakland Institute. She's also an internationally renowned expert on trade, development, human rights, and agriculture issues. Today, her presentation will discuss land and resource grabs along with strategies and solutions the Oakland Institute has implemented and are working on. This webinar will be recorded and posted on foodtank.com afterwards. You can also follow along and participate on Twitter using hashtag foodtank. Please also submit your questions. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. You can submit those in the chat box on your screen, on Twitter with hashtag foodtank, or email them to me, Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, @foodtank.com. So without further ado, Anuradha, it's wonderful to have you here and truly an honor. I'm excited to hear your presentation, and I'll give you the floor now.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone, for who's joined in. I am told that we have people from different time zones, so I won't say good morning, which it is for me here in Oakland, California. Thanks, Sarah, for that very kind introduction. Just a word about the Oakland Institute. We were started in 2004 with the idea of being an independent think tank to bring fresh ideas and bold action to the pressing issues so we could have fair debates, truly democratic participation in social, economic, environmental issues that impact our lives. As Sarah mentioned, I'm going to talk about one aspect of our work, which is not really separated from the rest, but given the work we were doing, it stems from that. And we had been looking at trade issues. We had been looking at the high food price crisis in 2007, which very deeply impacted developing countries, especially where the poorest people spend nearly 70 to 80% of their budgets on food. At the same time, there was a financial crisis happening. And then we saw institutions, even FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, talk about this win-win scenario where resource-poor countries but cash-rich could engage with countries which were resource-rich but cash-poor. And it seemed like a neat exchange where countries such as the Gulf states, other countries like India, could enter, say, the African continent and create a partnership where they could grow food, they could grow, export crops. And the whole idea behind that, or the assumptions that were being made, were that this would create development in places like Africa. It would create food security. It would create job security. It would create an opportunity for unused land to be put into productive use. It would lead to infrastructure development. So it was, as we were looking at the high food price crisis and we were looking at the causes and the impact of it, as we were looking at overall food security debates that are happening across the world, we as a think tank really wanted to look at if these, what we were hearing, that so-called investment in agriculture would really be an investment that would create food security, job security, and the rest is true. So as a think tank, we wanted to look into it and see if they are the truth or if it's just a myth. And that got us started in 2007, 2008 to start our research. The first few publications that we came out with, the Great Land Grab, because that's what we found when we started our initial research. We found that on one hand, you have institutions such as the World Bank, you have development institutions such as USAID or UK's DFID and others promoting this trend of pushing investment in agriculture, but without questioning investment for who and who benefits from it. In the wake of that, as a think tank, we realized that we could not just sit in Oakland and come up with a research. We selected 9 different countries all over the African continent, Africa, because it's such a poster child for all these development paradigms. And this included fieldwork, this included traveling with these so-called investors in their helicopters, spending time with the communities. Initially, we had thought that we could just go to the capital, show up, go to the Ministry of Land and Agriculture, and we could find, what kind of land deals are being processed. But very soon we realized that that's not going to work. There is such a lack of transparency and there's such a lack of accountability that very often you find some of the largest land deals have happened, land leases where land has been given away for 99 years for almost nothing, when you get to the community itself, when you get to areas where most people would not go. Let me just share key findings. Oh, by the way, before I start with the key findings, we selected countries to have the diversity. For instance, we had countries from North, South, East, and West Africa. We also looked at countries like Tanzania, which have had, stability compared to places like Sierra Leone, which have gone through civil war. We looked at Mozambique with the same kind of history. We looked at South Sudan, which was just about becoming a country. So we could look at what are the forces at work and what is the impact of this foreign investors coming into these countries, supposedly to invest in agriculture. So just to share some key findings, what we found after extensive field work in many countries, that the scale, rate, and impact of this so-called land rush is really alarming. Because you might say, Anuradha, what's different about foreign plantations in, say, African countries? We have had banana plantations in the Philippines, in the banana republics and all of that. But just the scale and rate at which it is happening right now, this rush for land in faraway places is quite alarming. Asia, Latin America, Africa, every continent is impacted, Eastern Europe, but most of the deals are happening in Africa, and I'll go into it a little bit more later. Very often we are told, oh, the Chinese are in Africa. What we have found, everyone is involved in this land rush, from, as I said, DFID to USAID to Norwegian companies to church groups to ambassadors from the United States. Everyone is involved in this resource grab. And then one of the big things is also about the myth of unused, unproductive lands. In most instances, we found that there were people living on these lands who are indigenous, who are very often agro-pastoralists or pastoralists, communities who have customary land rights. Or it could be a country like Sierra Leone where you leave land fallow because you come back to it. So you need those lands to be left fallow and that they're not unproductive. And of course, most of the deals violate FPEC, free, prior, informed consent. Given you have countries like Zambia or Papua New Guinea or in most places where the customary land rights, new processes are being set up to deny communities their land rights. And of course, the impact on national economy, livelihoods, and food security we found to be devastating. Just very quickly, most of the land deals that we saw in Africa, and by now we have looked at hundreds and hundreds of them, they're either for growing export crops. So it is not about improving food security of local communities or even national communities. It is, or for biofuels, which is definitely, given the mandates in Europe and in the United States, it's headed for those countries. Or very often we saw land just being taken over and being just kept vacant till they can turn it around and sell it for higher prices. On our website, you can find a video where CEO of Emergent Asset Management, she's no longer there, she's quoted as saying, she's at an investment conference where she's trying to encourage pension funds, university endowments to invest in their private equity fund. And she says, we can be moronic and not grow food and we'll still make money. They have vast holdings in Mozambique, South Africa, Swaziland, Zambia. Now, the way these morons make money is by basically turning that land around and selling it for higher prices. Similarly, just to say in terms of livelihoods, there is great research from Food and Agriculture Organization that clearly demonstrates that even 5 acres of arable land in Africa are enough to sustain a family. So if we assume that the family would at least have 5 to 6 people, you can see the impact of those 5 acres of arable land being used by a family farmer. Now, even if you have 100,000 hectares of land taken over for, say, a plantation, those kind of plantations don't create real jobs. They create menial jobs. They create seasonal worker jobs or sharecroppers. So you can imagine at most they might hire 1,000 people, which do not get the kind of livelihood they would have if they had the 5 acres of arable land. So this whole myth of livelihoods is nothing else but a myth. These large scale plantations, cotton sugarcane plantations in Ethiopia, or takeover of land for growing the largest rice plantation in Tanzania, they are not benefiting the local farmers. And you have to remember that in the context that nearly 70 to 80% of the food that is consumed in developing countries comes from smallholder farmers. So it is not coming from your ADM and Cargills and the others. So if you're displacing these farmers, it is a huge impact on their livelihoods, but also a devastating impact on the food security of the communities and the country. So in the course of our work, what we found, as I said before, that there is no transparency. We were shocked that the communities have been told suddenly one day that you have to move out, you're being displaced, whether it was Mozambique or whether it was Ethiopia, or whether it was Tanzania. But they have never seen any contracts. They have been told that the jobs will come. They've been told all kind of benefits will come, but there's nothing on paper. And in the course of our work, we were able to find a lot of, these contracts and documents, which are quite stunning when you look at what the national governments are giving away to these investors and basically for nothing. So for instance, in the case of Zambia, following the high food price crisis, when many countries put export bans to first feed their own populations, the government of Zambia was agreeing with these foreign investors. I mean, I kind of always hesitate to use the word investor because I'm not sure what they're investing, because it seems more like they're taking away. That even if there were food shortages, that, for example, Chetan Atlas could actually export, and majority of the foods, 80% of the foods that were grown and were produced and were being kept in a country like Zambia, even if there were food shortages. So they actually have these contracts signed. Or we found a contract which involved a US investor from Iowa, Agrisol, which was asking the Tanzanian government to change their laws so they could grow GMO corn for ethanol. They were going to pay only 20 cents per acre. This was the largest land deal in Tanzania that nobody had heard about. 800,000 acres of land was to be taken. They also wanted the country to take a World Bank loan to put in a railway line from the farms to the port so they could export this corn for ethanol. And when I met with them and I asked them if they had to promise a certain number of jobs to the Tanzanian government because they were going to give so much to Agrisol, their CEO laughed and said that the government is very understanding. They understand that given the skill set we would need South Africans. And then paused, looked at me, and then said white South Africans. So what we were able to do is to put out these contracts and hand them over to the communities, make them public. It was like the Dracula, which needed to be dragged out into the sunlight, and then it had no place to hide and run. It was quite incredible because suddenly it was not about the word of the investor who's promising to bring schools and hospitals and jobs versus the word of the community. It was really the word of the so-called investor versus their own damn documents. So what the truth is. The result of all this research was we started releasing reports. We did very detailed country reports that were put out in June 2011. They're all available on our website. These are almost semi-academic reports which kind of look at in detail what the impact and what are the consequences and what are lessons to be learned from this so-called investment in agriculture and in land in countries ranging from Mozambique to South Sudan to Tanzania, Zambia, and several other places. Along with that, we realized that we needed to focus on a communication strategy because, again, as I said before, very often people think that it is the Chinese or the Malaysian or the Indians who are taking over and colonizing resources of places like Africa. What we were stunned by was that everyone is involved, including United States universities, including Harvard University, Vanderbilt. Many more are involved, but it is very difficult to find out since the universities will not make available the information of where they're investing, which had a pretty dramatic result because it started reframing the debate. When I started, I said that, even FAO was saying that we needed to see it as a win-win strategy. It could be a new development paradigm. But the research that we started producing, which was really putting forward facts and figures from the ground, but at the same time, the stories and struggles of the communities who are losing their rivers, their forests, their lands, their livelihoods, a future for their children. It started reframing the debate, where even Kofi Annan, after the release of our reports, basically came out to say that it is neither just nor sustainable for farmland to be taken away from communities in this way, not for food to be exported when there is hunger on the doorstep. Local people will not stand for this abuse, and neither should we. So it has been very interesting to see that once you start putting the truth and the facts out there, the kind of impact it can have. Since then, we have found ourselves not just working within Africa at the Institute now, whenever we are contacted by communities, as we were in the case of Papua New Guinea, or by the Maasai in Tanzania, or by communities in Argentina, we have used our ability to do research to be able to bring facts and figures which are useful for the communities. Unlike some other think tanks, what we do is really do research which will meet the needs of the communities, which will provide them the tools to be able to debate or strengthen their struggle with the local policymakers or in courts. Just to give you an example of a land deal that we were stunned by, was in South Sudan. It was a deal for 1 million hectares of land, which was made by, surprisingly, by the US, a former US ambassador for Refugee Affairs, Howard Eugene Douglas. He passed away a couple of years ago. But this gentleman, while he was a CIA operative in Sudan, got to know people and got 1 million hectares of land for only $25,000. The contract, which the community had not seen, which had just come back to Mukaya Payam, the village of Mukaya Payam, not too far from Juba, after the civil war had ended. The country was just becoming independent. They were starting their life again. Howard Eugene Douglas got a contract whereby he could just cut down the precious wood trees, the teak trees. He could use the land to grow anything he wanted, from food to biofuels. But he also had the right to go looking underneath the ground if there was gold, diamonds, oil, and had the right to sublease it to a third party. This lease, obtained for $25,000, was to last 99 years. Based on our research and the report that BBC did a program, and the community heard the BBC program on their transistors. I was in South Sudan in 2012 when the community marched up from Mukaya Payam to Juba and got the President Salva Kiir to cancel the land deal. Again, it has been, as I said, the Dracula experience when you pull it out into the sunlight. I mentioned the Agrosol land deal in Tanzania, the largest land deal. One of the other things, Bruce Rastetter, who's a Republican kingmaker, used to own the third largest ethanol plant in the country. He had not told anyone that these 800,000 acres, which were spread over 3 areas, just in one area, over 160,000 people lived, predominantly smallholder farmers. They had come as refugees from Burundi over 45 years ago. So most of them were born in Tanzania. They spoke Swahili, not their own language. And they had been farming, and they were told that they would have to leave, they would have to destroy their own homes, and then they would be given citizenship papers. So once our reports came out, Bruce Rastetter, who also happens to be a regent on the Iowa State University, the students mobilized and challenged his plans because Iowa State University was getting involved in the so-called investment displacing smallholder farmers. Agrosol had hoped to break ground in November 2011. They have still not been able to break the ground. But 2 years ago, those refugees got the citizenship papers without having to move from their lands. That was great. Similarly, Harvard students mobilized to create Responsible Endowments Coalition. Their big motto has been no land grabs from Africa to Alston. They have been pushing the university to ensure their endowments are not invested in private equity funds, which are taking over lands and resources from people in Africa, for instance. And Harvard had to pull out its $500 million investment from Emergent. Similarly, Vanderbilt students mobilized, and Vanderbilt pulled out its $30 million investment, again from Emergent Asset Management. It's in our work, we have seen, as I said before, that a lot of land is just taken over. People are rushing in, especially into Africa, because A, they can get 99-year leases. The prices of land are anywhere from 20 cents per acre going up to, at most, we have seen $3-4. Now, this is the quality of land. You are seeing right now Heracles palm oil plantation started with New York-based Heracles companies linked to Blackstone, which went to Cameroon, got a 99-year lease for 78,000 hectares of land. They were going to cut down the world's second largest rainforest to create this palm oil forest. To the investors, they were boasting that the quality of land, for which they're paying almost nothing, if they went to Malaysia and Indonesia, they would have to pay at least $7,000 to $8,000 per hectare. But in this case, they were paying just $2-3 per hectare. This is a quality of land for which in the Midwest you would pay anywhere from $14,000 to $16,000 per hectare, or in UK $26,000 per hectare. So there's a real rush for Africa because you can get a 99-year lease where you pay just 20 cents per hectare per year. And then, of course, it's they are breeding corruption. In case of Heracles, we were able to show how a US-based company was violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act by meddling in the local governments, by paying people off and bribing people. The result of that was the deal was of 78,000 was reduced to some 19,000 hectares. Instead of 99-year lease, it was reduced to 3-year lease. And it's coming up for review this year, and we are getting ready to look at the impact, because the communities still do not want that palm oil plantation, which is not giving them jobs, which has been destroying their forest, taking over their farmland. But most important, what we have seen over the last 3 years happen, not a single palm oil seedling has been planted. Instead, it seems more like a logging company which has been illegally cutting off the trees, which have been sent to China for illegal timber trade. In the course of our work, I mentioned Ethiopia. We have become very, very closely involved. Ethiopia is a country where the government boasts that it has some 11 million hectares of land to give away. Just in Lower Omo and in the Gambela region, their plans would displace, and have already displaced, nearly 1.5 million people. These are predominantly indigenous people, agro-pastoralists. In the case of Gambela, these are the Anuaks. In the case of Lower Omo, we are talking about the Bodis, the Mursis. And the worst thing is the kind of human rights violations we're seeing in Ethiopia. In a country where there is no free media, there is independent media, there is no independent civil society, these people are being forcibly displaced, tortured, intimidated, arbitrary detention. And as one of the people told us, land grab is really becoming a life grab for us. In the course of our work, it is not just about doing research and providing facts from the ground. We have seen and highlighted the role of the donor countries, because very often Papua New Guinea, Ethiopia seem very far away. But this is really the result of what's happening in our own backyard. So for instance, in the case of Ethiopia, we have hammered away at the fact that the United States, which is the closest ally of Ethiopia in Africa. Ethiopia is our ally in the war on terrorism, which continues to do our dirty work in Somalia and South Sudan. We need to challenge development aid, which has been clearly linked to this forced displacement of people in the name of development in Ethiopia. Just 2 days ago, we released a report called Moral Bankruptcy, which shows a program of the World Bank, which even its own inspection panel showed was linked to the forced displacement of people in Ethiopia, was closed down last year, but then they reinvented the program and have signed away $600 million to Ethiopia so it can continue to displace people. So we are kind of, this is a strategy where we are looking at not just the so-called investors or the local or national governments, but we have to look at the international actors that are driving this development paradigm, which is really not bringing development. It might enrich a few, but the majority of the people, the most marginalized, are the ones who are suffering. No, I started my talk by saying that we are a think tank, but in the course of this work, we have found ourselves turning into an activist think tank. When we found in Gambela that following the massacre of the Anuaks in 2003, which was really about taking over the land and resources, and the governor fled, he's been now in jail. He was kidnapped and renditioned to Ethiopia 2 years ago. And he has been in jail charged as a terrorist. So given the research we have done, given the facts we know, we got involved to be urging President Obama to be telling his friends within the Ethiopian government to release political prisoners who are really land rights activists. I can tell you so many of my colleagues that I have come to know, Pastor Omar, Ashini, Jamal, Mr. Okello, they are in jail, all charged as terrorists because they're land rights activists in Ethiopia. Another new report that we released had to do with Papua New Guinea. We were asked by communities and villages in Papua New Guinea who heard about the work of the Institute to assist them in documenting what's going on in terms of the theft of the land and resources. This is a country where majority of land is customary land rights. And it was very interesting. On one hand, in 2013, we documented how most of the land deals within Papua New Guinea, nearly 5 million hectares of land, are illegal. But the government came back, first said that they would cancel those deals, and then said, but we need this investment for development. Our latest report, The Great Timber Heist, actually shows that there are companies who have been operating in Papua New Guinea for the last 20 years. But over 20 years, they have been declaring losses, so they don't even pay taxes. So much for development. So here are foreign companies that are pillaging and destroying your environment and taking away your forests and taking away your farmlands. And then they do not even pay taxes. And Papua New Guinea is facing one of the worst financial crises where public officials are not being paid, where the education and health budget has been slashed by 40%. Again, if you go to our website, you can see we try to disseminate our work, our findings in different formats, from a comic book, My Home, My Land, which is based on our research, to also looking at the other forms of land grabs. For example, in Sri Lanka, where it's really the Sri Lankan army which has taken over the lands following the civil war and using it for their own benefits. I had mentioned that we also look at the international development agencies. What we have found, the biggest promoter of these land grabs is the institution called the World Bank, which has been ranking countries on what they are like to do business with. Now, these rankings are not based on, say, Bhutan's happiness index. They are really based on if you're willing to give up your environmental standards, your labor standards, your protection of community land rights. And then they rank you. So if you are saying that we will give up free, prior, informed consent, you're ranked first. But then your neighboring country says that we will, ban civil society organizations as well as free, prior, informed consent, then you become first and the other one becomes second. So it's really a slippery slope, which is really, doing away with any kind of community rights. If your country says you'll allow easy entrance of pesticides, fertilizers, you get a good ranking. So with the community groups that we have worked with for so long, they are the ones who came up with the idea that this is our land and it is our business, and the World Bank has no right and no business to be ranking us. So we are also doing research and providing those research materials to the community groups that can challenge the bank to do away with its doing business rankings. I think the biggest message for us in our own work and learning has been that we went in as a think tank to do research, but what we saw, we could not unsee. What we heard, we could not unhear. And that has led to this very close involvement and work with our communities. And very often when somebody says, who are your partners? I always say sometimes our partners don't even have postal addresses. They're in faraway places, but we are seeing the impact of how they're resisting, how they're struggling for their land rights. In a couple of years ago, we were able to bring different communities all over Sierra Leone who were impacted by land grabs to come together and share their experiences and come up with strategies. And they created ALAT, which has now become the national watchdog organization to ensure transparency and accountability. And so they're struggling as a fist rather than their own individual struggles. At the end, I would say we all know that agroecological solutions and local food systems are central to transitioning to a sustainable future. And the key to that is really in the hands of smallholder farmers, fisherfolk, and pastoralists. So on one hand, while we're trying to reframe the debate upon this so-called investment in agriculture, but last year we had real fun when we could put out 33 case studies from 20 different African countries, which showed that if we really want to increase food production, if we want to improve livelihoods, if we want to deal with the climate crisis, the answer is in smallholder agroecological solutions. These case studies are available on our website. And the beauty of them is they're not just cutesy micro examples of what can be done. These are scalable studies. These can impact millions of hectares of land and millions of lives. So we know how to do these things. And what we realize is that the real issue is not that we don't know how to grow food sustainably or take care of the planet. We have to figure out how to remove those from power who prevent that from happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha. That was an amazing presentation. It has really kind of inspired our audience listening on different outlets. So thank you so much. We do have a lot of questions from our listeners. So for the next 10 to 15 minutes, let's go through as many as possible. And I'd like to remind our listeners as well that they can continue to send their questions in using the chat box on Twitter with #foodtank or email me, sarah@foodtank.com. So I'd like to start by asking you a question from a listener named Jill. She says, you've been working on these important issues for many years now. What are some of the bright spots you've seen? Have you seen policies for food security and sovereignty that work and are scalable?
That's a great question. In terms of policies, the agroecology case studies that I mentioned, are not just happening because of the civil society. There has been intervention of the governments as well. And that's why we put them out to promote and push and support the policy efforts that take place in developing countries, that this is the way to go. At the national level, we have not really seen, given the kind of pressure you find from institutions such as the World Bank. I mean, today you have a situation where if a country was to say, we will not allow foreign investors in to come and take over our land and resources, you would be called a communist threat. Your access to credit and loans from the bank would be taken away. So in terms of bright hopes and spots, and why personally I continue to do this work, is the communities. I mean, whether it's Papua New Guinea to Ethiopia, people are not about to roll over and give up their land rights. Their relationship with land is so different from, say, most of us. It's a completely different relationship. So, and I find that to be a bright spot. The success stories that I mentioned, that here was AgriSol with this powerful Republican kingmaker who wanted to displace communities, and once how the students from Iowa State mobilized with the communities in Tanzania, that's a bright spot. Same thing in South Sudan. But the challenge still remains, and that's why we continue to put pressure on the rich donor countries, on USAID, on DFID, and the World Bank, that move away and allow that policy space for developing countries to come up with their own agricultural policies, which are built upon consultation with the farmers and ensure, credit and extension services and the rest.
Thank you, Anuradha. The next question, well, first a comment from Barbara. She says, I am researching how to eliminate hunger and extreme poverty locally and globally simultaneously, trying to get more Americans involved in helping and supporting development needs in other countries. Yet we too have hunger and poverty. And she writes she's concerned on how to avoid similar problems.
Mhm.
And then a question from Matt that I think is very related, which is that journalist Frederick Kaufman wrote an article about the water grabs from the Nile in Ethiopia, inspired by research by the Oakland Institute. He said the response in America has been muted, and his editors said that articles about Africa, and particularly hunger in Africa, don't attract eyeballs. He's seeing the sad truth of that statement. So in your opinion, why is this?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to emphasize that hunger is not caused because we don't know how to produce enough food. And as the first person had sent in, we need to be really concerned that in this country, with the kind of resources we have the kind of hunger. We have, families, I think nearly 500,000 families with children that go to bed hungry. That should be, while we have presidential debates and stuff, that needs to be the biggest issue. It is so shameful that we have that kind of hunger in this country. But it also helps us understand that hunger is a result of political processes. It is because people don't have living wage jobs. It is because people don't have jobs with dignity in this country. It's because people are being denied their land rights and their livelihoods in developing countries. So it is very interconnected. Having said that, I think people still continue to be so aloof and moved away, and they do not realize that water grabs, land grabs, and I'm glad you mentioned, land grabs is not just about land, it is also about water. Most of the land deals that we saw are for the best productive lands which are arable. Nobody is going for unproductive, bad land. They're going for the best lands. And this resource grab, we don't realize how closely involved we are. For instance, that's why we were very keen on publicizing who is involved in it. It is our pension funds. It's Theacref. It is, Harvard University with its fat endowment, which is investing in these land grabs. And a lot more work needs to be done to make people aware that it might be our retirement funds, it might be my university that is actually involved in land grabs and water grabs in other countries.
Thank you, Anuradha. And the next question comes from Joe, and he says, can you speak about how land grabs and agricultural policy may play into this year's US presidential election, and especially in light of a recent Huffington Post article titled, "The Presidential Candidates Seriously Don't Seem to Care About Our Food Policy"?
I think if you look at the presidential candidates, it is incredibly scary that you do not see a debate and discussion around a different kind of farm policy. I mean, in this country, we have seen the devastating impact of the Farm Bill on the farming communities, on our environment, on our lands, and the earth of the United States. But at the same time, it was last year when, again, Bruce Rastetter, who was behind Agrisol land deal in Tanzania, he invited all the presidential candidates to come and share the platform with him to talk about how Iowa will feed the world. All the Republican candidates showed up and shared the platform with him. The whole idea was this large-scale industrial agriculture will feed Iowa and the rest of the world. Incredibly scary. And that is why people like Rastetter think that they can take over the lands of communities in Tanzania and elsewhere so they can get rich because they believe they're feeding the world. So a lot more work definitely has to be done. We know we have a very, very poor farming and agricultural system in this country. We have a system which has displaced, which is not working for the family farmers in this country, which has destroyed our topsoil, our groundwater, is poisoning our bodies and the environment. And this is the model of agriculture that we want to export to the rest of the world in the midst of the climate crisis. So it is a food system which is upside down and backwards and needs to be fixed.
Thanks, Anuradha. And you mentioned some examples of agroecological solutions, and there being some case studies also on the Oakland Institute website. Our listener, Peter, has a question related to that, which is, there is a need for land tenure reform, given the conflicting and overlapping traditional and modern systems, but how to reform to support small-scale farming and agroecology?
I would not necessarily agree with that because we are assuming the only way we can do things is the way we do in the West of private property, my land title. As I mentioned, there are cultures and countries where customary land rights have existed. People have a right to that land, and it's really problematic if you suddenly start titling an acre or whatever to every woman and man. Because what happens then is that in the absence of real support, whether it's credit or extension services, when your child is sick, it becomes very easy for that land to be sold. So this is customary land rights which need to be strengthened, whether it is a place like Zambia or whether it's Papua New Guinea. They need to be respected along with an agricultural model where, like, a minister in Papua New Guinea told us that we really need to change the mindset of the people in the country. And we were like, what kind of mindset change are you talking about? And he said, they need to not be so attached to the land so they can give it away so palm oil plantations can come in and they'll bring development. A Ministry of Agriculture was really in the business of getting people out of agriculture instead of supporting the smallholder farmers to stay in agriculture and continue with their biodiversity and this vibrant agriculture that they have in Papua New Guinea. So I would be a little cautious of these top-down Western solutions. Land tenure in some places might work, but it's not going to be the answer for all places. We have to respect and understand the commons and customary land rights.
Thank you. The next question comes from Kiara. She writes, a lot of misinformation reaches the international audiences on these issues, not necessarily intentionally, but because of the mismatching messages sourced by and from different channels. How can we coordinate a more coherent effort to educate the public around the world?
I think there are some wonderful organizations doing excellent work around these issues. In addition to the resources that I mentioned that are available on our website. And I will very proudly say that, you might not like what you read or see in our research, but you can't poke a hole through it. We have taken on some very, very, big so-called investors who have lost millions of dollars. The fact we have never had a lawsuit is because there's nothing they can challenge us on. As I said before, it is what they say versus their own documents. Then there are other groups such as Grain, which is doing, again, very excellent work. Check out their resources. They are at the community level. You'll also find groups, and through our website, you can learn about green scenery in Sierra Leone, or Act Now in Papua New Guinea. So again, the hopeful bright spot is that the communities are getting organized. They have their own organizations at local level. There's SAFE in Cameroon. So there's amazing work happening. And I think what we have to do is really, the challenge is on us to get informed and educated, because as I said, we are not too far away from what's happening in Cameroon, Papua New Guinea. People that we have control over, banks and institutions that we have more control over than these individuals and these communities. So we have a responsibility here.
That's wonderful, Anuradha, and I think maybe we can just expand on that as we are running out of time. And so the last question, maybe you can just build on some of the examples and other resources that you just mentioned. The question is, what can our food tank readers do to get involved in the issue of land grabs and make a difference? So in other words, maybe what are a few things that you do in your life that you think are good habits and others can follow as well?
Well, quick things. You will learn of actions and things you can do if you are on our Facebook or Twitter. You can take action. Sometimes when it was people who signed the petition to President Obama, that helps a lot. Find out where, if you have your university, where its endowment is invested. Form a group of students, talk about these issues if you go to a church or a temple or wherever, or your community group, talk about these issues, because very often people don't know about them. Check out the resources. As I said, a lot of these investors are based in our part of the world, so we can take more action. We can, from Norway to United States to other places in Europe. So there's a lot that can be done, but I would say get informed, share the information, and from these groups, you will say very often, take action, and please do when you see that.
Thank you, Anuradha. It was truly a pleasure to have you today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I want to give a really big thank you to you and let you know it was an honor to have you. And we at Food Tank think the work that you and the Oakland Institute is doing is truly amazing. Thank you to all of our listeners as well for sending in their questions and making this discussion more interactive. I just want to have one announcement before we wrap up, which is that Food Tank is hosting our next webinar on Tuesday, April 5th. With Simran Sethi. She'll be discussing, the topic of her presentation will be Saving by Savoring, the delicious reclamation of foods we love. We also have a Food Tank Summit coming up on April 20th and 21st in Washington, D.C. at the American University, which you can find more details on foodtank.com. Again, this recording will be posted today, later on foodtank.com as well, if you'd like to listen or missed any parts of Anuradha's presentation. Thank you again so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.